Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us.
Glad to be here.
Today we're going back to Dallas, November 63.
A day that changed the course of history, right?
Absolutely, the JFK assassination.
Hmm.
We're diving deep into a 1998 issue of Kennedy Assassination Chronicles.
Oh, wow. So this is like 35 years after?
Yeah, 35 years after the event.
Interesting.
But it's packed with new evidence and witness accounts that really challenge the official narrative.
I mean, even decades later, there's still new pieces emerging about this case, right?
Exactly, and that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating.
For sure.
We're going to be focusing on two main areas: the medical evidence and, of course, the Zapruder film.
Two of the biggest pieces of the puzzle.
Exactly. And what we found in this journal is, well, let's just say it's pretty mind-blowing.
I'm intrigued. Let's hear it.
Okay, so first up, the medical evidence. Have you ever heard of Savandra Spencer?
The name rings a bell. She worked at the Naval Photographic Center, right?
Yes, back in '63.
And her testimony about the autopsy photos.
Exactly. She claims she developed photos that showed totally different head wounds than the official ones we've all seen.
Yeah, her account is one of the big reasons people question the chain of custody of those photos.
Right, and she even described a photo with the brain next to Kennedy's body.
Which contradicts other accounts, like Dr. McClellan's observations at Parkland.
Yeah, he noted a lot of brain tissue damage, but Spencer says the brain in the photo looked undamaged, like it hadn't even been removed.
Very interesting. It makes you wonder if there were multiple sets of photos or maybe some were altered.
Right, and Spencer herself was confused. She wants those negatives to be found.
It would definitely shed some light on the discrepancies.
And to make things even murkier, there are conflicting statements from photographer James Fox and Secret Service agent Robert Bach about who actually processed the film.
Right, those inconsistencies in the official record just add to the mystery, don't they?
Okay, so we've got potentially altered photos and conflicting accounts. Now let's move on to the Zapruder film. This home movie that captured the assassination has been analyzed frame by frame for decades.
Absolutely. It's a key piece of evidence.
But this journal introduces an account from Anna Marie Coons-Walko, who claims she saw a virgin copy of the film at the National Archives.
A virgin copy.
That's what she called it.
What does that even mean?
She described it as much clearer and more detailed than any of the versions we usually see.
Wow, that's interesting.
And get this, she said she could never access that copy again, even though she had documentation.
That's strange. You'd think they'd want to preserve the best quality version, right?
You would think so. Plus, there's an HSCA document that says Kennedy reacts to a shot before he's even fully behind the road sign.
A detail that would change the timing of the shots.
And supposedly you can see that detail in the virgin copy, but not in the commonly released versions.
If true, that would definitely challenge the single shooter theory.
Right. And then there's the fact that the Zapruder film went through so many hands: the FBI, Life magazine, the government. Who knows what happened to it along the way?
Raises a lot of questions about authenticity.
Coons-Walko put it perfectly. Virgin or version? It's a question that really makes you think, how much can we trust what we've been shown all these years?
It really underscores the importance of carefully scrutinizing all evidence related to the assassination.
Exactly. So we've got potential issues with the autopsy photos and questions about the Zapruder film's authenticity. It's like we're just getting started with unraveling this case.
And we are just getting started. There's a lot more to unpack.
Okay, so remember, we said we'd be diving into some alternative theories about the JFK assassination.
You mean theories that challenge the lone gunman narrative?
Exactly. And this journal dives headfirst into one in particular, Dr. Bill Truhl's and what he calls the unified solution.
Ah, yes, Truhl's. His theory really throws a wrench in the conventional understanding of the assassination.
It really does. He argues that the idea of Oswald firing all the shots from the book depository doesn't match up with witness testimony, acoustics analysis, or trajectory evidence.
Right, and he makes a pretty compelling argument about the shot that hit James Tigg. That was the
bystander.
The bystander, right. Truhl says that shot actually happened later in the sequence than most people think.
Which throws off the whole timeline, right?
Right, and it casts doubt on the direction of the shots as presented in the Warren Commission report.
Okay, so if not from the book depository, where does Truhl's think the shots came from?
He proposes a triangulation of fire, with shots coming from the grassy knoll, the Daltex building, and get this, maybe even the county records building.
Wait, the county records building?
That's the one right next to the depository?
I thought everyone there was looking at the motorcade.
They were, which is exactly why Truhl's thinks it would have been the perfect spot for a hidden shooter.
So this unified solution Basically throws the whole book depository narrative out the window.
Pretty much. He argues that the men seen in the depository window were decoys, there to distract from the real assassins.
Wow, it sounds like a completely different movie playing out.
It does, doesn't it?
But what about Oswald? Where does he fit into all this?
Truls doesn't completely dismiss Oswald's involvement. He thinks Oswald might have been a patsy.
A pawn in a much bigger game.
Exactly. Set up to take the fall for a conspiracy he might not have even fully understood.
This is all so intriguing. It makes you wonder if we'll ever really know what happened that day in Dallas.
Maybe, maybe not. But at least we have people like Truls asking the tough questions and challenging the accepted narrative.
Absolutely. It's the only way we can get closer to the truth, even if it's a truth that's hard to accept.
And speaking of challenging the accepted narrative, there's one more thing from this journal I want to talk about.
Okay, what else do you have?
Remember, this issue came out in 1998.
Right, the 30th anniversary of RFK's assassination.
Exactly. And so, naturally, the journal also covers the Robert Kennedy assassination.
Wow, so we're going from Dallas to Los Angeles.
In one issue, yeah.
That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
So what's the latest on Sirhan Sirhan? Is he still in prison?
As of 1998, yes, he's still incarcerated. But the journal highlights the efforts of his supporters to prove his innocence.
Really? What kind of evidence are they presenting?
Well, Sirhan's attorney, Lawrence Teeter, makes some interesting arguments.
Like what?
First, he points out that Sirhan has no memory of the actual shooting. Then he brings up this theory that Sirhan might have been under the influence of hypnosis.
Hypnosis, you mean like mind control?
Exactly. The idea is that Sirhan was programmed to carry out the assassination and take the fall.
That's wild. But is there any actual evidence to support that?
Well, Teeter points to Sirhan's erratic behavior leading up to the assassination and claims of memory gaps.
Okay. But that's all circumstantial, isn't it?
It is, but Teeter also raises questions about the bullet evidence. He suggests that the fatal shot might not have even come from Sirhan's gun.
You're saying there could have been another shooter?
That's what Teeter and Sirhan supporters believe.
Wow, this is getting complicated.
And it gets even more complicated when you consider what the LAPD did with the evidence.
What do you mean?
This journal reveals that they destroyed over 2,400 photos related to the RFK assassination.
They destroyed evidence. Why would they do that?
That's what Sirhan supporters want to know. They believe those photos could have held crucial clues.
I can see why they'd be suspicious. Destroying evidence doesn't exactly inspire confidence in the investigation, does it?
Not really. It leaves a lot of unanswered questions.
So do you think there's any merit to Sirhan's claims of innocence?
It's hard to say for certain. The evidence is murky and there's no smoking gun, so to speak. But the inconsistencies and the destruction of evidence raise serious doubts about the official narrative.
It's incredible to think that we're still debating these cases decades later.
It speaks to the power of these events. They were so shocking, so traumatic, that they've become ingrained in our collective consciousness.
It's like we're trying to make sense of the senseless.
Exactly. And maybe in the process, we're also trying to make sense of ourselves and the world we live in.
That's a good point. These deep dives aren't just about uncovering the past. They're about understanding how the past shapes who we are today.
I agree. And I think as we delve further into this 1998 journal, we'll find even more layers to these complex and compelling events.
Well, I'm definitely ready to keep digging.
Me too. There's always more to learn.
It really feels like we're peeling back layers of history like an onion, you know?
It is, isn't it? And every layer reveals something new and often unexpected.
Exactly. And it makes you think, what does it all mean for us today? Like we're sitting here in 2024 trying to make sense of these events that happened over 60 years ago.
I think one of the big takeaways is that we can't just accept what we've been told about history.
Even the official story.
Especially the official story. We need to be critical thinkers and keep asking questions.
It's like we have to train ourselves to be these evidence-analyzing detectives, right? Always looking for those little inconsistencies.
Exactly, and that's really important for events as big and controversial as the Kennedy assassinations.
Because there's so much at stake, right? Our understanding of history, our trust in institutions, and ultimately, our ability to separate fact from fiction.
Absolutely. And it's a skill that's becoming more and more important in today's world, don't you think? With all the information and misinformation flying around.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So what advice would you give to someone who's just starting to explore these cases? What should they keep in mind?
Well, I think the first thing is to cultivate a healthy skepticism.
Don't just believe everything you read.
Right. Always cross-reference information, compare different accounts, and look for solid evidence.
So skepticism is key. What else?
Pay attention to details, even the small ones.
Like Savandra Spencer's story about the autopsy photos.
Exactly. One little detail can change everything.
It's like putting together a giant puzzle.
Exactly. And you might not have all the pieces, but with patience, you can start to see the bigger picture.
And sometimes you have to look at the puzzle from a totally different angle, like Dr. Truel's did with his unified solution.
He took all these seemingly random pieces of evidence and arranged them in a way that made sense, even if it challenged the conventional wisdom.
Okay, so we've got all this new information, but how much can we really trust any of it? I mean, this is a journal from 1998. Are we sure it's accurate?
That's a valid question. We always need to be aware of potential biases in any source.
Like who wrote it, why they wrote it, and what their agenda might be.
Exactly. Think about the author's background, their motivations. It all plays a role.
So we're not just investigating historical events, we're also investigating the sources themselves.
Precisely. We have to be aware of misinformation and propaganda. It's everywhere.
Which means we need to develop our critical thinking skills and learn how to evaluate sources.
That's right. Don't just accept things blindly. Weigh the evidence, look for corroboration, and form your own conclusions.
It's like being a detective, but for history.
I like that analogy. We're all historical detectives in a way.
So even though we're diving into this journal, we can't just assume everything in it is the absolute truth.
Right. We need to consider the historical context, the potential biases, the limitations of the information.
It's about engaging with the material critically, not just passively absorbing it.
Exactly. And that's how we get closer to the truth, whatever that may be.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive. We've uncovered a lot about the Kennedy assassinations, but also about how to do historical research.
And we've only scratched the surface.
There's so much more out there, right? Books,
Yep.
articles, documentaries.
A whole world of information waiting to be explored.
So for our listeners who are fascinated by these cases, I encourage you to keep digging. Check out the Kennedy Assassination Chronicles, do your own research, and see what you discover.
Just remember to approach it with a critical eye. Be aware of biases, question everything, and don't be afraid to challenge the official narrative.
Because as we've seen today, the truth is often much more complex than it seems.
Absolutely. The Kennedy assassinations are a perfect example of that.
So many unanswered questions, so many different interpretations.
And that's what makes them so captivating. They force us to confront the mysteries of the past, and maybe even the mysteries of ourselves.
You know, it's amazing how these cases still generate so much debate, even after all these years.
I think it speaks to the power of these events, how deeply they affected the nation and the world, really.
And all the unanswered questions, right? They just fuel the speculation.
Absolutely. And the idea that the official narrative might not be the whole story, or even that it might be intentionally misleading, that's a tough thing to accept.
It really shakes your faith in things, you know? Like, if we can't trust what we've been told about these major historical events, what can we trust?
Right. It raises these profound questions about truth and how history is written.
Like, who gets to decide what's true and what isn't? And how do we know we're getting the full picture?
Those are questions we should always be asking, especially when it comes to events as significant as the Kennedy assassinations.
So, looking back at all we've discussed about the medical evidence, the Zapruder film, the different theories out there, what's the main thing you hope listeners take away from this deep dive?
I think the most important thing is to remember that the search for truth is an ongoing process. We can't just passively accept information, especially when it comes to controversial historical events.
We have to be active participants.
Exactly. Do your own research, dig deep, question everything, and don't be afraid to challenge the accepted narrative.
And be aware of those biases, both in the sources we're looking at and in ourselves.
Yes, that's crucial. We all come to these topics with our own preconceived notions, and it's important to acknowledge them.
So it's not just about finding the truth, it's also about understanding how we arrive at truth.
And understanding that history is complex, messy, and often open to interpretation.
This has been a truly fascinating deep dive, and I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
There's so much more to explore with these cases. I mean, new information is still emerging even today.
It's a reminder that history isn't just something that happened in the past. It's a living, breathing thing that continues to shape our present.
And that's why it's so important to keep these conversations going, to keep asking questions, to keep searching for answers.
So for our listeners who are intrigued by the Kennedy assassinations, I encourage you to check out the Kennedy Assassination Chronicles and delve deeper into the sources we've talked about.
And don't stop there. Read books, watch documentaries, explore different perspectives. The more you learn, the more you realize how much there is still to uncover.
Exactly. And remember what we talked about. Keep a critical eye, be aware of biases, and never stop questioning.
That's the key to getting closer to the truth, whatever that may be.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Kennedy assassinations.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thanks for listening, and until next time, keep exploring.